welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, episode 17, Mr. MacArthur's Summer Funtime Beach Bash, Inchon, September 1950. Before we begin, I just want to apologize that this episode is a bit late. We've had water running into our bedroom on and off for the last few days, so I haven't had the time to finish this episode until, well, just before this episode is released. Again, I apologize, and I'm working on building up a buffer of a few episodes to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'm also figuring out why we have a small waterfall in our bedroom to make sure that doesn't happen again either. With things going quite poorly for United Nations forces in the first months of the war, Douglas MacArthur knew he needed to do something to relieve the pressure his men were feeling within the Pusan perimeter. That's why, in the middle of August 1950, he gave a small group of officers from the Army, the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force the directive to plan an amphibious invasion of Korea. These officers, essentially, had to answer a set of questions. One question they could not answer, though, but was looming over their heads through the entire planning process, was whether or not UN forces would be able to hold on long enough in Pusan to allow this new operation to even take place. But we'll talk about how that question is answered next week, when we go back to the Pusan perimeter. This week, we're going to spend the first half of this episode talking about those planning questions, and we'll spend the second half talking about the invasion itself and the aftermath. Now, when MacArthur convened this group of officers to plan this operation, he placed them aboard the USS Mount McKinley in Tokyo Bay. The Mount McKinley was an amphibious command ship that had been involved in the coordination of the amphibious assaults on the Philippines and Okinawa and was the command ship for the atomic tests at Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok. So it's kind of fitting that it would be involved in this ambitious operation to salvage anything positive from this disastrous war. Well, disastrous so far. And you can see, while they weren't in Pusan with the North Koreans breathing down their necks, these officers weren't exactly living the life of comfort in occupied Tokyo. And they certainly felt the pressure of the situation on the perimeter, with reports delivered daily about the small victories and losses that would dictate the conditions of their operation. The first and most important question, when planning any amphibious invasion, is where exactly that invasion should take place. There's lots of smaller questions that feed into that big question, like what is the main objective of the invasion, what are the geographic, oceanic, meteorological conditions of the area, what would it take to get the necessary number of troops and equipment to the invasion area, and are those ships available in the time required? What is needed to maintain the beachhead if the invasion is successful? And lastly, could the powers that be back in Washington be convinced of that invasion location? Before answering any of those subsidiary questions, MacArthur gave the planning group an answer to the big one. He wanted the invasion to go ashore at Inchon. That location shocked the officers present. Inchon was not a great place for an amphibious assault. For one, it was about 200 miles from Pusan and 150 miles from Daegu, far from the front line, meaning it would take a not insignificant amount of time for the invasion force and any breakout force from Pusan to link up. For another, it's less than 20 miles from Seoul, which was the nexus for the Korean People's Army at this point in the war. The KPA could surely quickly respond to any invasion at Inchon by diverting troops from Seoul to what was essentially Seoul's port. But to MacArthur, those two reasons to not choose Inchon were the perfect reasons to choose Inchon. Mounting an amphibious invasion so far away from the front was foolish and therefore unexpected. The element of surprise is important in the ability of a landing force to establish a beachhead quickly by shocking the enemy out of any established defensive positions. That Inchon was so close to Seoul was also a positive point in MacArthur's mind. I can say many bad things about Douglas MacArthur, but I have to admit the man understood the power of symbols in war, especially the symbolic value many people place on places. Seoul was one of those symbolic places. Recapturing the capital with an ambitious landing far behind the front line would be a propaganda coup for MacArthur and a massive morale boost for the troops fighting under his command. Furthermore, MacArthur knew that recapturing Seoul would limit the ability of the KPA to quickly communicate with their forces in the southern country or transport forces north to south. Seoul was the golden idol that made an invasion of Inchon worth the trouble. None of that's to say that there weren't real concerns about the viability of Inchon as a landing site, or about the ability of MacArthur's subordinate commanders to pull something so ambitious off. Bill Sloan, in his book The Darkest Summer, lists 7 specific concerns U.S. Army Chief of Staff Joe Collins had about Inchon. 1. The port of Inchon is only accessible through a single channel that, because of its relative narrowness, could easily be mined or otherwise blocked, including by a disabled ship of the landing force. 2. The tides of the port were particularly strong because much of the surrounding waters were shallow, meaning that, while high tides were right up against the seawalls, low tides left long stretches of salty mud. Furthermore, high tide would not last long enough to allow American landing ships enough time to disembark their troops and withdraw safely, requiring them to be left on the mud until the tide returned. 3. One of the features of the harbor is the small island hill of Wolmy Do, which is only about 350 feet tall, but overlooks the entire port and would allow the KPA to fire down upon any landing force, requiring it to be taken before the main force landed, which, when considered with the tides, would require the Wolmy Do force to wait for the tides to return to be reinforced by the main landing force. The island was connected to Inchon via causeway, running right into the center of the city, increasing the risk that the Marines on Wolmy Do would be kicked back into the sea. 4. There's not really a beach at Inchon, just tall concrete seawalls that present an obstacle immediately upon landing. 5. One portion of the assault force would be put ashore right near Inchon, which at the time was well urbanized and had a population of 250,000, making house-by-house combat a real possibility. 6. September is primo typhoon season in Korea, making inclement weather probable for the proposed D-Day of the invasion. 7. And last, Inchon, while close to Seoul, was separated from the capital by the Han River, meaning another amphibious crossing would be required if bridges were blown by the KPA, and considering that the ROKA had already blown a good number of bridges in the area during their retreat, the KPA would not have too many more to destroy to force an amphibious river crossing upon the UN forces. For those 7 main reasons, Collins struggled to approve the Inchon plan. It didn't help MacArthur that Collins wasn't really a fan of him either, for the same reasons that pretty much anyone trying to command him disliked MacArthur. He was arrogant, vain, didn't listen to orders from his superiors because he thought himself better than them, refused to consult with his superiors on operations he was planning, and took credit for any successful operation conducted by those below him, regardless of his actual input. These were all things known to the leadership back in Washington, but MacArthur was such a personality that to fire him at any point, past or present, would not have gone well with the voting public back home. That doesn't mean MacArthur didn't have some good things going for him. For one, the strategy behind this Inchon gambit was sound. It had worked before. Specifically, it had worked in MacArthur's march through the Southwest Pacific during the Second World War. Just to refresh everyone's memory, MacArthur was forced out of the Philippines in 1942 after the Japanese invasion of the island nation. He then landed in Australia, and shortly thereafter was given effectively a split command in the South-Southwest Pacific, with U.S. Navy Admiral William Halsey. From here on out, U.S. ground forces, the Army under MacArthur and the Marines under Halsey, island-hopped their way around the main Japanese base at Rabaul, on New Britain Island, in Papua New Guinea. For smaller islands, this was a theoretically easy strategy, just jumping from island to island and bypassing the ones too well defended or not worthwhile. On larger islands, like those present in the Malay archipelago in the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur employed a hook and trap strategy. This would place one landing force on one end of an island, usually the end closest to Australia, then have subsequent landing forces advance across the island by hooking around the enemy by another amphibious assault and landing further up the coast of the island. This allowed U.S. forces to avoid getting mired down in the jungle common in this part of the world, and it asserted U.S. naval dominance in ways that forced Japanese forces into isolated pockets. That experience gave MacArthur the confidence, the real confidence, not just the baseline level of confidence MacArthur appears to have had in everything he did, the real confidence to pursue this modified hook and trap strategy against the North Koreans. Inchon was not the only option for an invasion to relieve the pressure felt around Pusan. Collins was a proponent of landing at Kunsan, just over 100 miles west of Daegu and 100 miles south of Seoul. Kunsan itself was not a horrible spot for a landing. It was well situated to rendezvous quickly with a breakout force from the perimeter, and its waters were not nearly as treacherous as Inchon's. But those are kind of the only selling points it has over Inchon. It would have been easier to land a force at Kunsan, yes, but it would not have been such a shock to the North Koreans as Inchon was expected to be. Landing sites on the east coast were also considered as alternatives to Inchon, but had the same issues as Kunsan. They would work fine, but they did not have that shock value MacArthur was looking for. To get that, only Inchon would do. The final approval for Inchon came from Truman in August, with Truman calling the proposal, quote, a bold plan worthy of a master strategist, end quote. So the Inchon operation can now leave the proposal phase and enter the proper planning phase. First, the operation needed a commander. For that post, MacArthur selected his chief of staff and battle-hardened general, Edward Ned Almond. Wait a minute. Sorry, I misspoke there. In my notes, battle-hardened is actually spelled Lightweight. Well, that's interesting. That can't be right at all. Lightweight. That spells lightweight. Military lightweight. Surely MacArthur would choose a battle-hardened son of a gun to lead this difficult and vital operation. And even then, Almond was an army man, and the landing force for Inchon was going to be mostly Marines. Surely MacArthur would choose a battle-hardened Marine son of a gun to lead this difficult and vital operation. No, I see now. Yes, as written by Bill Sloan, Ned Almond was a military lightweight, not a Marine, and greatest skill as a general was appealing to MacArthur's ego. MacArthur wanted someone who would simply act as a conduit for his own orders, someone he could micromanage, someone who would never question Caesar. The force Almond was given command of was originally known as X-Force, but to limit confusion about the name, it was pretty quickly renamed 10th Corps and separated from the 8th Army that the troops around Pusan were under. A quick aside, I've seen this corps named both X and 10th, so for now we're going to stick with 10th Corps. If you don't like that, let me know, and I might decide to switch to X Corps. Essentially, this was MacArthur keeping 10th Corps directly under his command. And that was even more apparent when Almond maintained his position as MacArthur's chief of staff alongside his new command of 10th Corps. That, combined with a statement MacArthur sent to the National Meeting of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and American Veterans Association, basically stating the opposite of the Truman administration's official stance on the Republic of China, really made some people back in Washington quite angry. In his VFW message, MacArthur stated that aggressive leadership was needed to solve the issue presented by Taiwan, going against Truman's stated stance that only a peaceful resolution would be supported by the United States. At the end of August, Truman was considering firing MacArthur, especially after MacArthur just straight up ignored a memo from the Joint Chiefs suggesting Kunsan as a better landing site than Inchon. He only held off because he was satisfied with replacing his Defense Secretary, Louis Johnson, with George Marshall. Marshall had managed MacArthur before, during the Second World War, and Truman hoped he could do it again. This would not be the last time that friction between MacArthur and Truman would be an issue, though, but that's for a future episode. On August 30th, MacArthur gave the order to move full steam ahead with the operation as planned for Inchon. It took just over a week, though, for those orders to make it back to Washington, and those still weren't a fully detailed set of plans. Those arrived on September 14th, just one day before D-Day for what was now known as Operation Chromite. The Joint Chiefs weren't the only ones for whom MacArthur purposefully muddied the waters. False operation plans circulated among the Marines in Pusan, quite obviously marked as confidential, that placed the coming invasion at Kunsan. One Marine, as written by Sloan, stated that a copy or two of those plans were lost, most likely picked up by North Korean agents. This misdirection was supported by small raids up and down the coastlines, allowing UN forces an opportunity to practice their landing skills and timing while distracting the North Koreans. Further misdirection operations were directed at Pusan, with American and British commandos landing on the 13th and multiple air raids keeping the KPA on their toes as to the final position of the invasion. As with many large military operations, a small team of brave individuals was able to answer those specifically detailed questions needed to ensure Chromite's success. That team was led by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Eugene Clark, alongside ROK Navy Lieutenant Yun Juk and ROK Intelligence Officer Colonel Ki In-ju. These 3 men, with 10 other men under their command, captured the island of Yonghung-do, about 15 miles southwest of Inchon. This pre-invasion force recruited local Koreans into a new observation force that surveyed the water depth at various times and points across the harbor, that took stock of KPA troop placements and numbers in Inchon, and tracked the tides for the first 2 weeks of September. Through this small but vitally important operation, Yun, Ki, and Clark discovered that the narrow channel through which the invasion fleet would have to travel before landing was not mined in any serious way, that only 2,500 inexperienced and poorly equipped KPA soldiers held the city, with 500 more on Wolmi-do, and that Japanese tide charts were much more accurate than any other tide charts for the harbor. On the last day before the invasion, the 3 observers evacuated a few hundred of their local assistants to the small island of Palmi-do, directly in the channel the landing force would need to traverse. Clark switched on a navigational beacon and waited for his countrymen to arrive. On September 13th, MacArthur held his final meeting before the invasion. Each service branch was represented, and, as written by Bill Sloan, each complained about something specific. The Navy complained about a typhoon in the Sea of Japan that might crash the party, the Air Force complained about poor visibility with the expected weather conditions, and the Army complained about not having the equipment to quickly get to Kimpo Airfield or Seoul to capitalize on their advantage. The Marine commander present simply stood up, said that the Marines would land at Inchon at 0630 as ordered, then sat back down. The landing force, comprised entirely of elements of the 1st Marine Division at this point, was to land at 3 beaches at 2 different times: Green Beach on Wolmi-do at 6:30 a.m. and Red and Blue beaches on the mainland at 5:30 p.m. when the tide came back in. Operation Chromite was a go. The U.S. and British navies bombarded Wolmi-do and Inchon for 2 days before the first landing on the morning of the 15th. The entirety of Wolmi-do was denuded by the constant barrage of artillery, rocket, and bomb. This was all somewhat expected by the Korean People's Army. Documents dated August 28th state that KPA command believed Inchon was a likely place for invasion given its proximity to Seoul, but by the 15th, the desire to defend Seoul and Inchon was outweighed by the much larger desire to put as many North Korean soldiers on the Pusan perimeter to push UN forces out of Korea entirely. That's why there were so few defenders present in Inchon on D-Day of Operation Chromite. And again, that's what we'll talk about next week. Just one KPA regiment, the 87th, was stationed at Inchon by the time of the invasion. A brigade, listed as Unit 884, was responsible for a 5-kilometer stretch of coastline north of Wolmi-do. Both the 9th and 18th Divisions, which would have been responsible for responding to a landing at Inchon from their positions in Seoul, moved down to the Naktong front on August 12th and in early September, respectively. The 3rd, 10th, and 13th Divisions were stationed along the Seoul-Pusan Road and were the logical choices for reinforcing the capital region, but again, these divisions were focused more towards the threat in the southeast, not on anything happening near Seoul. By September 15th, this all means that there were about 2,500 soldiers in Inchon, 500 on Wolmi-do on top of that, 500 at Kimpo Airfield, 10 miles to the northeast, and another 5,000 in Seoul, 20 miles to the northeast. In total, and these numbers don't exactly match, there was roughly 10,000 KPA soldiers in and around Seoul in the capital region around September 15th. At 6:30 a.m. on the overcast morning of the 15th, the men of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment went ashore at Green Beach on Wolmi-do. The island by now was barren, with few defenders left alive in their caves and trenches. They were easily overtaken, and the island was secured within an hour and a half, paving the way for the next stage of the landing. But that would not come until 5:30 in the evening, as the landing force had to wait for the tides to return to get their landing ships close enough to the shore. As those two landing forces moved in on the beaches, a light rain began to fall, making the decks of the landing ships just a bit more slick. The two beaches for the evening landing, red and blue, were each protected by 16-foot tall concrete seawalls, surmountable only by ladders. A quick note, none of these beaches actually exist anymore. The coastline has been pushed out anywhere from 100 feet to a mile, just because this area has been so built up and infilled since the end of the war. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 5th Marine Regiment went ashore at Red Beach, north of Wolmi-do and into downtown Inchon. 3 battalions of the 1st Marine Regiment went ashore at Blue Beach, south of the city. As the 1st Marines landed on Red Beach, it became a tale of two assaults. The northern portion of the beach was the site of fierce fighting from the very beginning. The southern portion was much calmer with little resistance encountered. At Blue Beach, the greatest resistance offered to the men of the 1st Marine Regiment was done so by the high seawalls. Few casualties and little meaningful resistance is reported of the actions at Blue Beach, although the men going ashore wouldn't have known that until their boots were in the mud. As the sun set on D-Day, 13,000 UN soldiers, including a regiment of ROK Marines, were ashore in Inchon, opening a new front in the war, 150 miles from their comrades. On the morning of the 16th, the two landing forces closed around Inchon by 7:30 a.m., forming a single line from which they could advance towards Seoul. Naval and aerial bombardment continued to cover the UN advance, with any KPA armored columns or large troop movements quickly attacked from above, once spotted. By the end of the 16th, the line was 6 miles inland, a third of the way to the capital. It is during this period that the ROK Marines attached to the landing force took responsibility for security in Inchon. Their commanders believed that, while many KPA soldiers escaped Inchon during the bombardment and initial attack, a good number remained in the city disguised as civilians. This was half true. The number of disguised soldiers was exaggerated by the ROK military to cover for the deaths of civilians at the hands of ROK soldiers. That's not to say that Inchon residents weren't excited to see South Korean soldiers. Mostly, they were. These folks were not exactly thrilled with the KPA's presence in their city, especially considering there were multiple instances of the KPA killing civilians falsely accused of collaborating with the southern regime before they fled Inchon. With Inchon secured, the 5th Marine Regiment set off towards Kimpo Airfield, and the 1st Marine Regiment set off towards the south bank of the Han River, directly across from Seoul. The next day, the two regiments fought a small skirmish against a KPA force of 250 soldiers and 6 tanks, quickly defeating them. Later that day, the 5th Marines got lost in a field on their way to Kimpo, finally reaching the airfield around 6 in the evening. The relatively sudden arrival of the Marines and their attached armor spooked the few hundred KPA defenders, with many abandoning their posts or quickly killed by the Marines' M26 Pershing medium tanks. By nightfall, the 5th Marines captured the airfield but were not yet able to secure the surrounding hills. Elsewhere, as their partner regiment captured Kimpo, the 1st Marines settled into a hill 2 miles southeast of Kimpo and 9 miles southwest of Seoul. On the 18th, sporadic fighting continued as the 5th Regiment secured Kimpo and an engineer battalion prepared both to cross the Han and to reopen the airfield. The 1st Regiment continued towards Seoul, reaching the Han on the 19th. They too prepared to cross the Great River. They were joined by the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division in their preparations, but the 7th Division was to move south and ensure UN forces in Seoul weren't cut off from Inchon. Across the Han, the KPA's 18th Division was recalled from their march towards the Naktong to defend Seoul. The fate of the capital was again on the line. The rapid advance of the UN forces from Inchon to the Han River appears to have frightened the KPA commanders in this area. A certain amount of panic set into the KPA's preparations for the coming Second Battle of Seoul. And while it is true that the 10th Corps would have to cross a wide river to actually retake the city, they had a great deal of momentum on their side. It had only been 4 days since this force first landed in this part of Korea, and now they were already knocking on the door of the linchpin of the KPA's communications and transportation network. The KPA directed all units not fighting along the Naktong to Seoul, with an estimated 20,000 KPA soldiers in the city by the 19th. The first UN forces to land on the north bank of the Han were 14 Marines of the 5th Regiment who swam across the river around 9 p.m. to a ferry landing just north of Kimpo Airfield. These Marines patrolled the area for a few hours, made no contact with the enemy, and signaled for a full company to cross the river. As that company was crossing the river, they ran into a surprising wall of mortar and machine gun fire. The KPA units in the area were on a nearby hill that the Marines had not yet searched. Their nighttime roll of the dice failed, and the Marines battered the area with artillery fire the next morning to force their way across the Han. Successfully crossing on the 20th, they reached the outskirts of Seoul itself late on the 21st and waited for the order to move into the city. As the 5th Marines was crossing the river, the 1st Marines was locked in a fierce battle with a KPA counterattacking force. Every foot of ground was paid for in both American and Korean lives. On the morning of the 21st, the good General Almond visited his troops overlooking the town of Yeongdongpo, southwest of Seoul, which he ordered them to destroy. As the Marines moved through the devastated paddies of the town, they were surprised by hidden KPA defenders and only reached their goal after sustaining the heaviest casualty of an American unit in the capital region thus far. By the end of the 22nd, the 1st Marine Regiment was finally ready to move into Seoul. With the 7th Infantry Division providing a defensive line south of Seoul, Anyang and Suwon, the American 5th Marines and ROK 1st Marines fought their way through the KPA's western defensive line for Seoul in 4 days of brutal combat. The KPA held a strong ridgeline that allowed them a good defensive perimeter from which they could repel UN attacks. These KPA forces were actually fresh reinforcements of the 78th Independent Regiment, who had moved to Seoul on the 19th in preparation for this battle. Many of the 78th's commanders had experience fighting in the Chinese Civil War, so this was a well-organized regiment that fought particularly hard. The American 1st Marines crossed the Han on September 24th, slowly closing a bear trap around KPA forces in Seoul. Aerial reconnaissance reports came in saying large masses of people were visible north of the city, moving away from Seoul. The final push for the capital was set to begin on the 25th of September, as Almond ordered, but given the events of the day, the commander of the 1st Marine Division feared pushing into Seoul in the night could lead to unnecessary confusion among his troops. Almond demanded progress, and the final push into Seoul began at 10 p.m. that night. But, just as UN forces were about to move in on the city, the KPA launched a large counterattack, with KPA forces only withdrawing after heavy losses on the morning of the 26th. Even with the bulk of local KPA forces withdrawing from Seoul on the 26th, stubborn street fighting continued for the next 2 days. Barricades made up of rice bags filled with dirt were easily constructed and easily defended by a few machine guns or riflemen. Snipers were a constant threat to UN forces trying to find ways through or around the barricades that appeared to be in every intersection. According to the Korea Institute of Military History, one barricade could delay a full battalion for an hour. The fight for Seoul was difficult, but quick, as the KPA just did not have the manpower to match what the UN forces could throw into the city. On September 27th, UN forces, both American and South Korean, occupied much of Seoul and the capital region. Down in Osan, about 30 miles south of Seoul, the leading elements of the 8th Army's breakout force, Task Force Lynch, made contact with units of the 7th Infantry Division at about 10:30 p.m. on the 26th. 91 days after it had been captured, Seoul was liberated, or it was stolen, depending on which side you support. With the Pusan perimeter broken and Seoul recaptured, the momentum of the Korean War had shifted from the North Koreans to the South Koreans and their American allies. The race to the Yalu was on. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with United Nations forces closing in on the 38th parallel after a daring amphibious landing 150 miles behind enemy lines. Next Tuesday, we will be back down around Pusan to discuss the brutal fighting there in the first half of September and the eventual breakout of UN forces after the Inchon landings shock the KPA in the second half of September. We will meet back up with the soldiers of the 10th Corps in 2 weeks' time as they prepare to cross the 38th parallel. If you are on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday, unless our bedroom is flooded. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.